Not to forget, inshallah, to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for those who are oppressed and weak from our brothers in Gaza, and not to forget this, inshallah. This is something that we should always be upon. And the dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the most important mean in a believer's life, and it to have with certainty and yaqeen that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept the dua of the believers, and to put things in the right perspective, since everything is by Allah. Talking about the benefits of fasting, or some of the benefits of fasting. And the last thing that we talked about is purifying ourselves, purifying one's nafs. And this important meaning that many people overlook, the meaning of purifying your nafs, that means is to remove the sultan or the authority of one's sinful desires and shubuhat and doubts and things like this, and to be in charge of yourself, to be in charge of oneself by the will of Allah. You know what is khair and what is shar. If you know what is good and what is bad, and that requires for the person to have the knowledge of it, then be in charge of your own self. Don't let your desires overtake you. You know that coming to the masjid for Salatul Fajr is a good thing. It's better than this entire world and whatever it contains. You know that. Then what happens? Who's in charge? Who has sultan on you? Your own nafs with its desire, or the fact that you know the ilm has a sultan, the sultan of the knowledge. The knowledge is the authority that a person would have with submitting oneself to Allah, seeking help from Allah. So the importance of al-ilm wal-amal, the knowledge and the actions to be associated with it. One of the things that he mentioned here is that to protect oneself from al-ashar wal-batar, the manners and the good deeds that comes with as a result of having the good manners, to protect oneself from al-ashar wal-batar. Al-ashar is when a person, all the evil actions or all the evil characteristics, anything that is evil has to do something with transgressing a limit. So we have limits, and these limits are not supposed to be transgressed upon. You cannot go beyond these limits, otherwise you fall into sins if it's the rights of Allah, or when it comes to akhlaq and manners with others. There are limits. There are limits for everything. So al-ashar is when someone is his intense anger, or so he go beyond the limit of having a stern attitude or anger or things like this. To be angry, this is a normal thing. There's nothing wrong with being angry. And actually, as we heard before, that Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah, he said, the one that does not get angry, he is himar. He is a donkey. Right? Because human beings, they get angry. But how are you when you're angry? That's the thing. What are your limits when you're angry? Are your limits the deen of Allah? And as the Prophet ﷺ, when he commanded a Sahabi, says, La taghdab, awsini la taghdab. Give me advice, he said, don't get angry. What is meant by this is, don't act against the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you're angry. And one of which, or according to your anger, but according to the ilm, to the knowledge. And if it's in a way that you have to suppress it and express what is good, mashallah, this is good. So this is al-ashar. Al-batar is when a person transgress the limit when it comes to the ni'am, the favors of Allah. You have a favor from Allah that He bestowed upon you. Then you don't observe the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you. He gave you money and He made a limit for you. You cannot just spend from your money the way that you like, in spreading corruption on the face of the earth and haram. Right? You have limits. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gave you this favor. He gave you your health for a reason. So use it according to the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set for us. And have always good thinking, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would never deprive you from any matters of goodness. But it's this issue of being fooled by our own selves when a person follows their desire. One of these benefits of fasting, and as mentioned, if those who are not with us before, if something is an obligation upon you, then it's an obligation to learn about it before its time comes. Right? So before Ramadan, we have to learn what is obligatory upon us. And we already know it from last year. Some don't. Maybe they never fasted in their life, or they became Muslims. And also, we tend to forget, because these things comes once a year. So we have to revive it. And it's not just about learning, but it's about bringing these meanings in our hearts to make the ta'zeem, to exalt the commands of Allah, and to gain rewards from Allah. So one of these benefits, he says, أنه يعرف العبد نفسه وحاجته وضعفه وفقره لربه. This is the benefit that we always get when a person do an act of ibadah, and one of which is fasting, which is a very unique thing to fasting, is that the person knows himself and that he is in need of Allah. He knows his weakness. He gets to realize the weakness that he has to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and his faqr, that he is in need of his Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala. When a person is fasting, what happens? You see how weak we are, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us like this. Look at yourself when you're hungry, and when you're extremely hungry, right? All of this greatness of what you think you are is all blown away. Right? How weak the human beings are, or even much weaker than that. Someone tells you a word that you don't like, disturbs you in your entirety. You become upset, sad, miserable, angry. How weak the human beings are. So one of the benefits of the ibadah is to humble oneself. And this is always a common thing in the deen of Allah, because the worst enemy to oneself is this kibr, or this arrogance that makes the person always in state of disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is what a person would find himself. So فَإِنَّ النَّفْسَ, this nafs, you have to wean it from its norm. And one of the things in the month of Sha'ban, now you started the season, Sha'ban and Ramadan and so on, where your norms needs to be disturbed a little bit. It's okay. We have our comfort zones, our norms every day. This time you drink your coffee, you wake up at this time, you sleep at this time, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with it. But sometimes you need to be tested, and you need to be upon that flexibility, the strength, that your norm is disturbed and you're fine with it. Many people would fail. And we as Muslims were not supposed to be like this. Why? Because even just as simple as the winter and the summertime, time of the salah is changing. You cannot set a time for Fajr. Your time of work is 8 o'clock in the morning, for example, but the time of Fajr is not the same. So it shows even that something that if a person have means, things will change. Our time, our norms is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us. So Fajr time at 3 o'clock in the morning, then you would come for Fajr at 3 o'clock in the morning. If it's 6 o'clock in the morning, you'll come at 6 o'clock in the morning. Yes, there requires some struggle, yes. Things are not the same all year, yes. But that's the command of Allah. The same thing in Ramadan. You know, people are thinking, what am I going to do with my time of work, less sleep, this and that? Yes, change the norm, it's okay. Seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's part of seeing how weak we are, and to wean ourselves against this ma'lufat, the norms that we invent for ourselves. So whenever a person is abstaining from food and drink and even sleep for the sake of Allah to make the salah, a person would feel what? You need to feel in your heart that you are in need of Allah, that you are so weak. You're not that strong, so you feel the help from Allah. And seeking help from Allah, as we said, we don't seek help from no one but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the ubudiyyah that needs to be observed. Not to humiliate oneself by asking others or asking your enemies to help you. No, we don't need that. We need to seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Sahaba radiallahu anhum were upon this. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for us to be physically weak, that's the qadr of Allah. We seek the strength from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we take the means, but without feeling or expressing this weakness to other than Allah. There's some characteristics, if it's done to the human beings, it's all miserable. And the same thing if it's done to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's an honor and strength. One of which is this al-faqr, to be in need. Al-faqir is the faqir, the poor person, right? But to have the faqr to Allah, to be in need of Allah, to beg from Allah, to make dua to Allah, to feel that you are nothing, you have no power, you have no wealth, this is strength in itself. this is the strongest person on the face of earth because he would rely only upon Allah. The same characteristics, if he's doing it to a makhluk, to a creation of Allah, this is miserable, this is not good, this is a person that is humiliated, and he's always in state of misery, even though it's the same thing. And if it's not this way, it's going to be the other way. If you don't strengthen your weakness to Allah, if it's correct to say, you are basically strengthening your weakness, meaning you're becoming weaker and weaker when it comes to the human beings, and vice versa. So till a person, and this is the benefits of the ibadah, that a person is relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completely, like Rib'i ibn Amir radiallahu anhu, when he was going to meet the king of Persia, and he's wearing patched clothing and riding on a mule, and the king of Persia said to his people, let's show all of the adornments so that these people coming, the Arabs, these Bedouins, when they see how strong we are, they become scared and they become humiliated and they run away. And he came with a spear, as you know the story, popping all these pillows of silk that they put it to make him mesmerized. He's like, wow, this is such a great thing. Looking at the dunya, he tied his mule into one of these pillows, and he walked to him and he says, "Nahnu," and the story is long, but he made it very clear, "Nahnu qawmun ibta'athana Allah." We are people that Allah sent us. لنخرج العباد من عبادة العباد إلى عبادة رب العباد, to take the people out of the worship of the creation of Allah to the worship of the Creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to take them out from the tightness of this dunya to the spaciousness of the dunya and the hereafter, and to take them out from the injustices of religions to the justice of Islam. No fear whatsoever, where hearts are relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and this is the strength of the believers they would get. One of the ways to achieve this is with the ibadah, because it shows the weakness that we have, and this is the strength of the believers. And وَيُذَكِّرُهُ بِعَظِيمِ نِعَمِ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. The benefits of fasting, the benefits of the ibadah is that a person is reminded of the great favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon him. And this is another sad reality of the human beings. We are like this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us like this, so we have to do something to gain that strength against our weakness. What is this? We forget the favors of Allah. And whoever says, no, I don't forget, you're lying. We forget the favors of Allah. You have it with every breath you take. Who among us, and we mentioned that before, right? Who among us, he is grateful to Allah with every breath he takes? Or it's only when he's not able to breathe? What happens when a person is not able to breathe? He would see that how much of a great ni'mah there is that a person is breathing, correct? So are we from among those who would only realize the favor of Allah when it's taken away from them? This is a sign of foolishness. As Ibn Qudam and others, they said, you are, with all due respect, and we are like this. We are fools when we only remember the favors of Allah when it's taken away from us. To be in a masjid and to make salah, right? And to be able to listen to the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, great ni'mah from Allah. Are we realizing this favor of Allah, or we wait till it's taken away from us and then we say, oh, we used to, and it's such a great thing? We have to be grateful to Allah now and at all times with anything that we see of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala it's pleasing to Allah. So a person finds himself coming to the masjid, able to sit in the masjid. How many people on the face of earth that they don't have this ability, for example, and having the means to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not to be fearing their life even if they're able to make salah. So the heart has to be working on this. So part of the ibadah is for the person to remember the great favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon a person, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows our weaknesses. So when it comes to food and drink and desires, okay, it's an obligation upon you not to do it, so that you remember this favor of Allah, because we are like this. So we train ourselves to remember the favors of Allah. You see in Ramadan, for example, when you every day is fasting, you remember the good old days when you used to wake up in the morning and drink your coffee and eat breakfast, right? You're not able to do that anymore, right? And then after Ramadan, you're going back to your norm or so, but again, it reminds the person of the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon us, and that's what he mentions here. And as some of them that said that health is like a crown on the head of those who are healthy, but only the sick people, they see it. If someone is sick, he sees the healthy people as if they're wearing a crown, the crown of health, right? The healthy ones, they don't see it to one another. Only when a person is sick, he sees it, right? And this is something that we should always remember, that a person should not wait till that happens. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give everyone health and cure those who are sick. And this is the qadr of Allah. This is how things are. But a person should be grateful to Allah and sees that he is wearing the crown of health when he's healthy. To use it, what is the meaning? Or to say, oh mashallah, alhamdulillah, I'm healthy. This is yes, to be done like this. And for the heart to have this in it. And then to use it in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave it us for. To make ibadah, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to seek the halal. Not to use it to abuse ourselves by committing haram and being wasteful. So this is something that it comes with also with the ibadah. So the issue of, which is a very important one, this issue of shuhud al-ni'mah, to constantly witness the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not to wait till a person is deprived from it, and then he would realize how great this ni'mah was. So when a person is fasting, by the mercy of Allah, you get to practice this being deprived. Now you know the favor of Allah, then you're given the food and Maghrib time and things like this. So it makes the person always remember the favor of Allah. And وَيُذَكِّرُ أَيْضًا بِحَاجَةِ إِخْوَانِ الْفُقَرَاءِ, and to remind oneself of the need of his poor brothers, those who they are in need of food and drink. And we see that. And the world is becoming very small. You can see what's happening to the ummah in the east and the west. So what to do? Is to be sad and miserable when we do these types of things? No. And by the way, if a person is pushing away sadness, it doesn't mean that he doesn't feel for his brothers. Sadness, al-huzn, yud'ifu al-qalb, makes the heart weak. And this is one of the objectives of the enemies of Allah, to make the people weak, to make them defeated, to see that they're hopeless, they are defeated, they are gone. And they are successful if the people like this. And so if a person constantly watching the miseries and all of this, what happens? If he doesn't treat himself in the right way, he falls into that trap of sadness and misery. And people think that if you're not sad, that means you're not feeling for your brothers. No, actually it's the opposite. What is meant by this is these types of things should make the person rely upon Allah more. And this is the strength. Yes, that a person would be hopeless from all of the human beings. They would never help you. They would never be of any means of goodness to you. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the person would strengthen his relationship with Allah. Repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, call others and enjoin good and forbid evil for people to be steadfast upon the deen of Allah. And seeing things in the right way and form. Witnessing even the names and attributes of Allah. How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Halim. He's the most forbearance. He does not punish the people immediately. He gives them time, whether for them to repent or to increase their sins, or for people to revive and renew their covenants with Allah. Is your covenant with Allah based on materialistic things in this life, or you seeking rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter? If someone lives a life of difficulty and being oppressed and so on in this life, but the moment of death is the most joyful one for him, is that what he is seeking, or he's seeking only the matters of this dunya? And the best, of course, both dunya and the hereafter, no doubt. But it's all great benefits, and one of which is to feel for them. And one of the benefits of fasting is this. And with that, فَيُوجِبُ لَهُ ذَلِكَ شُكْرَ اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى, that brings by necessity to be grateful to Allah and to seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the favors of Allah, to be obedient to Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us something, then we use that favor to help others when it comes to food and drink and wealth and health and everything. For everything, if it's correct to say, there's a zakah for it. There's zakah of the money, the wealth that you have, and there's the zakah as if it's a zakah for one's health, for all the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon us. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the ayah, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you attain the taqwa. And this taqwa, as he says, it's part of this. So what is the objective of fasting? is to be among the people of taqwa. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So that the fasting will make you be upon those who have the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as-siyam is wasila, is a ibadah in itself, is an objective because this is the command of Allah. And it's a mean to attain at-taqwa, to attain the fear of Allah and to be dutiful to Allah, which is the obedience of Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to do what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us to do and to stay away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade us from, with ikhlas, with sincerity to Allah and love and hope and fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is how a person would shield himself from the punishment of Allah. So how easy the matter is, by the mercy of Allah, that He would make the siyam obligatory upon the believers, so that they are as if they are dragged to be among the people of taqwa. So you would attain the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the joy of this life and in the hereafter, which is basically taking a shield, shielding oneself from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One last thing is, before we end inshallah ta'ala, so siyam shu'batun azimatun min shu'ab at-taqwa. One of the great parts of at-taqwa is shu'abul iman. Al-iman is shu'ab. Iman is parts. As the hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, that al-iman is bid'un wa sittuna shu'ba, 60 something parts. أعلاها قول لا إله إلا الله. The highest of it is لا إله إلا الله, and the lowest of it is إماطة الأذى عن الطريق, to remove an obstacle from the path of the people. As-siyam is a great part of the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's one of the means to come closer to Allah, and it's a mean to strengthen the taqwa in matters of deen and dunya. So this is how the qurba ila Allah, to be close to Allah, ما تقرب إلي عبدي بشيء أحب إلي مما افترضت عليه. That a person before the month of Ramadan, he can't wait till he fulfilled the obligation that Allah obligated upon him, to get him among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love. If you fulfill the obligations, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love you. You can never be closer to Allah by anything better than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated upon us. So this is the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of course there's so many benefits there, and we'll talk about this inshallah ta'ala. We'll continue with that tomorrow. But as we heard, we need to, it's not about waiting, it's an immediate thing, and we need to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and be dutiful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to remember that everything is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our hearts are controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our physical actions. So to constantly rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for all of us, and to make us witness the month of Ramadan, and to make us always in the state of being steadfast upon the deen of Allah. Sallallahu alaihi wa sallam. If you have any comments or anything.